So, Chris, what's the plan for today's episode?
What do you track? Like on a daily basis? Tracking? Are you like counting calories? What do you
Not
steps?
calories.
Do you track steps?
Steps. This started, I used to blow myself away every weekend with the number of steps I would do when I was still a server or a bartender.
Yep.
And so since then, it would be pretty embarrassing to show how it's gone down since then, but I do still track my steps.
My 7-year-old has a Fitbit, and when
Whoa.
he doesn't get 15,000 steps, like there's a problem. He's disturbed. I would
Really?
say. Yeah, like it bugs him that
See, he's 7.
He's 7. Yeah.
Well,
I don't know. Why does he have a Fitbit? It's a good question. He wanted one, basically.
He needs to know.
I'm Christopher Shulgin. I'm executive producer of Eat Move Think.
I'm Jasmine Ratch. I'm managing producer of Eat Move Think.
Today, we're talking about the future of tracking, I would say. Have you heard of continuous glucose monitoring? Do you know what that
definitely
is?
heard those words.
So glucose is blood sugar.
Yes.
So last year, the world's fastest marathoner, Eliud Kipchoge, I think he broke 2 hours.
Amazing.
Last year?
Oh, cool.
Anyway, he started using something called the Abbott Libre Sense Glucose Sport Biosensor. So essentially this measures your blood glucose level in real time. And it's yet another thing to track your blood glucose levels, but people are talking about it as a way to determine how to optimize your nutrition when you're preparing for a race, when you're training. And then also to watch what you drink and how many gels you take and when you start taking gels while you're actually racing. And so the idea is that eventually we'll be able to use the armband biosensors, the things that diabetics use on their arms to track their glucose and when they need insulin.
Yeah.
That athletes will be using these.
Right. Athletes without diabetes.
Athletes without diabetes, yeah.
Okay.
And so this is happening in research trials. It's happening in Europe. It's not currently available or approved by Health Canada or the FDA.
Oh, Europe's always one step ahead.
The point is we're exploring this. We're not endorsing this.
Okay.
We're not saying
learning.
that people should do it. We're learning.
I mean, it sounds pretty alien. It sounds pretty futuristic.
It sounds
so
science fiction.
I think
yeah.
it's important that we learn.
And this is, thanks for that. And this is it's the direction that things are going with the Apple Watch or the Oura Ring or the Whoop band. And, it's fascinating to explore.
It is. I'm curious to see how effective, like a scientist would think this would be, because a lot of the time with these new technologies, maybe they're not so accurate yet, but they're still being sold. So,
should we bring?
Here?
Yeah, should we bring the scientist into it?
I think I would like that.
Okay.
I do trust you, but I would love a scientist's opinion too.
Dr. Mike Riddell is a professor at York University's School of Kinesiology and Health Science. He's published widely on the topic of blood glucose, diabetes, and exercise. He's a scientific advisor for Supersapiens. That's the company behind an app that allows you to track your blood glucose levels over time.
Very cool. And so I can download that?
No, it's not yet available in Canada.
Okay.
But this stuff is being used for research studies and at elite levels for athletics and for science and marathons. I also wanted to mention Riddell is interesting also because he's diabetic. So he's been living with diabetes for 35 years, I think, and using these continuous glucose monitors because he needs them. He needs them to survive.
And he's also an athlete, so he's kind of like
he's
the perfect person.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
I'm stoked. And who's he chatting with today?
Interviewing Dr. Mike Riddell is Anna Topali. She's Medcan's fitness manager. She graduated magna cum laude from York University's kinesiology program.
Here's Dr. Mike Riddell in conversation with Anna Topali.
Hello, Dr. Michael Riddell, and welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Hi, Anna. I'm great, thanks. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. So before we get into these devices and how they work and the story behind them, let's provide our listeners with some primary context. So basically, why glucose? What exactly is glucose? Break it down for us.
Sure. Glucose in its basic form is an energy source, and all of the foods that we eat that have any carbohydrate in them have to be broken down into glucose in its basic form to be taken up by the gut and then circulated in the bloodstream. So glucose really is the breakdown of the carbohydrates in our diet and is an important fuel source for functioning of the brain and also for functioning of the skeletal muscles when we exercise.
Excellent. So if you break that down, because I think people have more understanding in regards to glucose, let's say in specific to diabetes,
Yeah.
how is glucose's role different in people with diabetes?
Well, glucose is an essential fuel, that's for sure. We need to have glucose in our bloodstream, in our bodies at all times. But in diabetes, the amount of glucose, the concentration of glucose in the bloodstream skyrockets. It goes up. And that's because typically the body isn't making enough insulin, the hormone that regulates our blood sugar levels. Either the body's not making enough or it's not using insulin properly and the sugar's too high. But we all need some glucose in our bodies. In fact, the average person has maybe 5 to 15 grams of glucose circulating in the bloodstream. And that's really critical for keeping the brain happy and functioning and allowing the body to produce energy, to produce ATP. So diabetes is just simply a type of glucose dysregulation.
So for example, within diabetes, they'd have to monitor that so closely and keep it within such a tight little frame. How can one control glucose levels in the body, let's say for someone without diabetes?
Yeah. I've been living with type 1 diabetes myself for 35 years, and I think about my glucose all the time. But for you who doesn't have diabetes, Anna, you might not think of your glucose, but your glucose is really held in a tight range. It has to be held somewhere between 70 milligrams per deciliter up to maybe as high as 140. And your body automatically does its best to try to control that concentration. But we can see that sometimes blood sugar does go above that target and sometimes it goes below. And if you don't have diabetes and your blood sugar goes above that target, that's a sign that maybe the foods that you're eating aren't really being metabolized as efficiently as your body really should be, because we know that a higher glucose can correlate with all sorts of different diseases. Even if you're not diagnosed with diabetes, a higher glucose is kind of bad in the long run, causes all sorts of damage to the body. So if you don't have diabetes, your body tries to keep it in that tight range. But of course, we have all sorts of choices in our life that can affect that, like the things that we eat, how we sleep, if we have caffeine or not, when we exercise, how long we exercise, and what type of exercise we do. So for me, I have to think about it more than you do. But I think with CGM, glucose monitoring, you can start to learn a bit more about how your body's handling glucose.
Love that. So if we break it down with the CGM, how specifically do the glucose levels affect endurance exercise performance?
We've been studying how glucose levels affect performance in diabetes for more than 20 years with the technology that we're talking about, continuous glucose monitors. So we know a lot about that. But actually, surprisingly, we know less about, if you don't have diabetes, how your body's responding to exercise and how blood sugars might impact performance. We think that it may be possible 20% of the time that your glucose is out of range where you'd like it to be for exercise performance. So using a continuous glucose monitor, you can start to see when your blood sugar is drifting a bit too low, maybe below 110 or 90 milligrams per deciliter, or maybe drifting too high. And with that information, seeing it, you can start to change your behavior. You can alter what you're consuming as far as a performance beverage or a performance snack. You can change your macronutrient composition in your diet. You can lower the amount of refined carbohydrates, increase your protein, for example, if you see that your glucose is out of this so-called target range that we think does influence performance, even in non-diabetics. In fact, if I could just speak to that briefly for a few more seconds, we know that in people who don't have diabetes, if their blood sugar drops below 90, they often get some symptoms of weakness, a little bit of disorientation, sometimes a little bit clammy, a little bit sweaty. And we know from studies from almost 100 years ago that if the blood sugar drops below 70, they could feel exhausted, just exhausted, and be unable to compete at the end of the Boston Marathon, for example, which was shown almost 100 years ago. So I think to summarize with CGM, which is kind of a newer technology for people who don't have diabetes, with this newer technology, you can start to put a lens on your own glycemia and see how you can optimize it.
Right. I think everyone's kind of been there at some point where you start getting that lightheadedness. You spend just a little too long between meals. You get a little grumpy, a little
Exactly.
irritable. I can't even imagine that feeling during an exertion event, marathon, or anything like that. So it's a really good point. You kind of touched on it, more endurance type sports. How is it different for, let's say, resistance training or shorter bouts of exercise, like high intensity interval training? Can you expand on that?
Yeah, what we've seen so far is that in people who are well conditioned anaerobically, they can produce a lot of lactate, a lot of power. They can do interval sprints. They can lift high reps. We start to see their glucose rise, and we think it's related to the adrenaline that's associated with that form of exercise. If you think about that sprint or that burst of energy, we know we get adrenaline, and adrenaline does increase blood sugar levels because it tells the liver to squeeze glucose into the circulation. So we see the blood sugar go up. And in fact, we've seen some people who perform exceptionally well have some of the higher blood sugars that we thought we could see in a person who doesn't have diabetes, maybe up to 140. And so it might be that having a slightly higher glucose level during those types of burst activities, or even at a sprint at the end of an endurance ride, might be beneficial. And we're still kind of learning and trying to prove that as best we can with some of the studies that are ongoing in this area.
Would you say, so regardless of, let's say, the type of exercise that the person is performing, is the recommended glucose level the same for everyone, or is there a specific target we should be aiming for?
Well, we often see the recommended target to be, somewhere, let's say between 90 and 120 milligrams per deciliter. But we know that some people are competing above this threshold, for example, and doing exceptionally well. So I think it might be more individualized than we had initially thought. It might be that for you, you do best at 130 or 125. It might be for another person who doesn't have diabetes, they might actually perform best at 110 or even 90. So I think it's something that we can learn over time. If we use a CGM for a few weeks, we can start to better understand your own performance band, your own performance zone, and try to hone in on behaviors and foods that'll keep us in that zone, in that band.
Right. So then keeping that zone in mind. So if you have diabetes, we've said it's really important to know your glucose levels. If you're an athlete and you don't have diabetes, why would it be important or helpful to know your glucose level and to keep you in this zone?
hmm Well, for diabetes, you have to keep an eye on it for safety reasons. It's a matter of life and death for diabetes. But for the athlete who doesn't have diabetes, it's more like a performance leverage. So it's not as if your glucose is going to go so low that you're going to lose consciousness, or so high that you're all of a sudden developing diabetes after you have, let's say, a sugar-coated donut. But you're going to find out pretty quickly the foods that your body reacts to make it skyrocket, at least transiently. And what's interesting is if you don't have diabetes and your blood sugar skyrockets, then you get a surge of insulin. And that actually causes the sugar to drop right when you're in the performance zone that you want to be in. And all of a sudden, you've lost that zone where you know your performance is best. So I think it's a tool that athletes could use to understand their own unique physiology of exercise and glycemia or glucose control, and understand exactly where they need to be for their top performance. Sure, it might improve your performance by 2% or 10%, maybe 20%, but I think for all of us, there is likely an optimal zone that we could do better keeping our blood sugars in during competition and training.
Right. Because I know there's been correlation between carb loading close to an event.
Mhm.
Could you kind of break that down for us? So, for example, for an athlete that wants to do carb loading, how would he or she benefit from using a CGM to make sure that he's carb loading at the right time, timing it with the performance?
I think carb loading is such an important concept for us to learn about. But you do it blindly if you don't have a CGM on, right? You load with a bunch of carbohydrate, maybe it's rice and pasta. You don't really know how high your blood sugar goes and how long it stays elevated. The idea is to fill the muscles and the liver up with enough stored glucose, glycogen, so that you can perform well during your endurance ride. And with carb loading and a CGM, you can better titrate the volume of carb, the number of grams you consume, the type of carb. Is it a low glycemic index carb or is it a high glycemic index carb? And make sure the tank is chock full of glycogen before you do your competition. Many people do this wrong. They actually excessively carb load 2 hours before the competition. And what that does is that causes eventually a rise in glucose and then a rise in insulin just as the person is about to start or just has started their race. And that, in combination with the muscles contracting and taking up glucose, the glucose plummets. And we've seen time and time again in laboratory studies and also in the field with CGM that people are not carb loading properly. It should probably be earlier. And then you should limit your carbs in this window that might be up to 4 hours before competition. But then there's the second issue that the CGM helps with, and that's when to start fueling during the race. And often we don't even think about it, right? We feel pretty good. We start the race, and then we might start to sip carbohydrates an hour into the race. But with a CGM, it might actually be 30 minutes into the event that you need to start sipping carbohydrates. And so I think your eyes can really open with this newer technology to allow you to better fuel before the event and then fuel during the event. And also perhaps even limit our carbs during the training period where we think there may be also some advantages, which I can talk about more if you want.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we think that the body responds in a more adaptive fashion if we carb restrict a little bit during training. And many of our athletes who you know and who I know do like to carb restrict. We might limit to 50 grams or less of carb a day. And that's actually good during the training state because the mitochondria in our muscles become better efficient at metabolizing fat, which is also an important fuel source for the muscle. But it's not your performance fuel source during some parts of the competition when you need to sprint or you need to go over, let's say, a 2-hour event. You need carbohydrates as well. So if we expose the body to a little bit of low carb and using a sensor, keeping the glucose maybe between 70 and 90, then we're fine-tuning the mitochondria in the muscles to be more able to burn fat during our endurance events. And then in competition, the muscles are more metabolically flexible. They can burn carbohydrates, but they can also burn lipid. And having a metabolically flexible muscle is the secret, I think, to endurance performance.
So let's say for someone that doesn't take in a lot of carbs. So for example, an athlete that's maybe on a keto diet. I know that's kind of, not that I want to call it a buzzword, but it is, it's a trend. We've heard more and more about keto diet. So how would you, with the CGM, how would you relate that to someone that is on a keto diet and maybe lower on carbohydrates?
Yeah. Well, I think a CGM is really valuable for people who want to try a ketogenic diet. We know that it helps with weight loss. We know that it helps with glycemic improvement. And we think it actually helps with mitochondrial fine-tuning to be on these diets. So with a CGM, you can see if your blood sugar ever goes above 90. If it does, then that diet's not working because glucose goes above 90 milligrams, you get a squirt of insulin, you're no longer ketogenic because insulin and the slightly higher blood sugar just puts the brakes on ketone production. So with a sensor, you simply want to keep that glucose targeted between 70 and 90, and your ketogenic diet will be much more successful. Either that or you're testing for ketones all the time, which is difficult because that requires finger sticks, although there are some new breath ketone analyzers that are becoming more and more commonplace. But I think a glucose sensor is as good or better than some of these other ways of trying to monitor your ketones all the time.
So then with some of these devices, for example, what is the difference between a flash glucose meter and a continuous glucose meter?
Mm-hmm. All of the sensors that we're talking about go under the skin. There's a small little filament that is an electrode that goes under the skin, and that electrode has chemistry in it that reacts with your glucose. So in a way, there's some similarities between a CGM and a flash glucose monitor. What's different is that the continuous glucose monitor that's real time uses either Bluetooth or radio frequency to then communicate that glucose level to a reader. It could be a watch, it could be your iPhone or your Android phone. The flash glucose devices have to have a mechanism that swipes the sensor to then pick up the glucose value. So the flash sensor can give you the same data, but you don't see it in real time on the device. You have to literally swipe the arm or swipe the sensor where it's worn on the body and then see where the data is. So there's subtle differences in the visibility of data, but they're basically measuring the same thing.
So let's say an athlete's wearing their glucose monitoring. How might they train or eat differently? I know you kind of touched on this prior as well in terms of, if you're doing strength training, if you're doing endurance training, but now that they have some sort of data to work off of, what sort of changes can they now make in order to get better?
Well, that's such an important question because it can be data overload when you first get this device on because you're getting all these numbers, new numbers that you're not that familiar with. So the first thing you need to do is just settle down into your usual routine and observe the data. So you can then learn what your body's doing in the fasted state, in perhaps the ketogenic state, in the training state, but also during a performance ride or performance run. So observation is critical.
Mm-hmm.
Don't do anything for the first few days other than do what you normally do, I think is kind of critical. Then after you've worn that first sensor, maybe that second sensor or the second set of days that you wear it, you need to start to manipulate the system a bit. Try to see what foods and what eating patterns can get you into what we think might be your performance zone, which could be, let's say, 110 to 120 during competition, or 70 to 90 during training when you're trying to change the mitochondria expression in your skeletal muscle. So what foods to gravitate to? You could wear a sensor for a weekend and then realize that bananas are not good for you. Or, maybe grapefruit is, maybe a ketogenic granola bar is, but other foods you got to steer away from, like white rice. So I think it's about manipulating the diet and then getting yourself into what we think theoretically is your performance band for glucose. Then I think we need to fine tune and customize, because it might be for you, you find that you do best at 130, 140, or maybe you don't see anything that makes any difference. And maybe you're just lucky, glucose doesn't seem to be playing a role in your performance. But I think for probably 60% of the people out there, glucose plays some role in their performance, and trying to understand what it is exactly they perform best in. That takes a bit longer, right? Because there's several variables that can influence our blood sugar. And sometimes the sensors aren't reading accurately. So we have to learn, I think, a bit more by wearing them a bit more until we understand where your performance zone is and where your training zone is.
Right. You had a really good point about data overload. And between, CGM, and then you've got the Apple Watches, and then we're just turning into little robots with all these devices that we can monitor. When you're making the changes, what would you say should be, let's say I'm getting all this information overload. What would be like the top, if I was to triage the changes that I need to make, target number one, what should I change first, let's say, between diet, my day-to-day, or closer to performance? How would you attack that?
Yeah, I think it's great to make a list of maybe 4 things that you think you could do better with your CGM. Those 4 things could be a better fasted glucose, a better pre-ride or pre-race glucose, and then a better in-ride or in-race glucose. You just write those 3 things down and then manipulate only 1 or 2 things at a time, because you won't know what it is that you manipulate. If you change 5 or 6 things, you change how you sleep, you take out caffeine, you start to switch to a ketogenic diet, you don't really know what variable is changing. So try to make small steps methodically to understand how your body's responding to these adaptations. And it'll be interesting for you to see that within about 7 days, we've seen that athletes will change their behaviors in such a way that they'll narrow their glucose excursions. So their mealtime excursions will drop. They may shift the baseline in ride performance, and they may change their fasting glycemia. Within 7 days, we've seen it in these athletes who don't have diabetes, just by making subtle changes that are really customized to the pattern of eating, the types of foods we eat, their rest, their training, recovery, and their in-ride performance.
Let's say we're not talking about someone that's a professional athlete and is not that closely regulated in that sense. What would be a more realistic timeline until they might see differences if they start implementing these changes?
Well, we have seen amateur athletes surprisingly make a change within 2 weeks, to have a different glycemic profile within 2 weeks, which I was surprised to see. I thought it might take, a month of behavior change. But the beauty of CGM is that it's immediate biofeedback. When you eat that snack, you immediately see the result of that snack. So your brain is processing all the time. Stay away from Smarties, eat whole grain breakfast cereal. You make these changes along the way, and within 2 weeks, you'll have a different glycemic profile. Absolutely.
Can you give the listeners more of a breakdown in terms of the difference between glycemic index and glycemic load? Because I know you had mentioned both at some point.
Right. Okay. So the term glycemic index was invented to compare different standalone carbohydrate foods relative to white bread. So white bread was considered the gold standard for quantifying how much your blood sugar might change when you eat carbohydrates. And it was discovered that some fruits that have fructose in it have a little bit more of a blood sugar response than white bread. And a lot of foods have less of a glycemic response. If you have, let's say, steel cut oatmeal in the morning with a little bit of raisins and some milk, you get a lower blood sugar response compared to white bread. So glycemic index is everything relative to white bread. And in theory, The higher the number, the worse it is for you, particularly if you have diabetes or if you're really worried about your blood sugar going high after foods. The glycemic load is similar, but is slightly better because the glycemic load looks at when you consume a carbohydrate in the context of other macronutrients that you always eat. Like you always eat protein, typically when you have some carbohydrate, like you might have some peanut butter on your white bread, and some fat. Peanut butter has some fat in it. The glycemic load tells you what that meal does with the carbohydrate, the fat and the proteins over a span of about 2 hours. Not just how high the sugar goes, but how long it goes and how long it takes before it comes back down to that pre-meal state. So glycemic load is a slightly better, I think, term. And if you use a CGM, you can start to get an idea of that because you can see the little bump in your blood sugar go up when you have that meal. How long does it stay up for, and how long does it take before it comes back down to baseline? And ideally, you want that window to be quite small. You want the glycemic load to be quite small because you know you're pushing that energy into your cells. It's not sitting in the bloodstream. And it's getting the glycogen and the muscle levels, amino acids, prepared for that exercise event. So people can use this glycemic load as a marker of the quality of the foods that they're eating while they're training and even competing.
Right. So if you're breaking it down, let's say I'm looking at my results, I ate a snack, I'm looking at my results from my CGM. What would the ideal kind of graph look like?
Yeah.
Describe that to us.
Yeah, that's great. So let's say that you have a snack that has, let's say 30 grams of carb and some protein and some fat in it. You want to start before that snack and see that your CGM is sitting somewhere between ideally 70 and 90 milligrams per deciliter. And then you have that snack, which is trying to assimilate 30 grams of carbohydrate plus all the protein and lipid, and you see that glucose go up. You ideally want it to not go past 110, 120. Then you know your body is really not letting that sugar sit in the bloodstream very long. It's literally pulling all that sugar and carbohydrate into the muscles and into the liver. So your sugar never really goes above 110, 120. Many of us will see it go above 140, in fact. And it'll peak probably around 30 minutes after we have started eating. And in some people, it might take 2 hours for it to come back down to 90 again. Some people shoot back down quickly, and some people shoot back down and overshoot the baseline. In other words, they go too low.
What would that scenario look like?
We call this reactive hypoglycemia, where it's a fancy term for when your blood sugar goes up. Your pancreas secretes insulin to bring it back down, but it secretes too much. And because you're so insulin sensitive, because you've been training, the blood sugar just disappears really quickly. So a little bit too much insulin, a little bit too much sensitivity in the muscle and liver because you've worked out and you're an athlete, the blood sugar drops below 70, which is not good. That's when you start to hit the wall, right? You could even be driving a car and lose focus and lose concentration. You could be in an exam or writing a paper if you're a student, or if you're performing, you just happen to have this reactive low blood sugar during performance, your cadence is going to drop, your wattage is going to drop, your speed's going to drop for sure.
Right. So to tie it back to diabetes specifically, and let's say you have an individual with diabetes, he's a little hesitant to start becoming more active, mainly because regulating his glucose level is, perhaps a challenge. How would working along with a CGM device help someone with diabetes wanting to get more active?
That's such a great question. And it's a game changer because we know that having really low blood sugar, really high blood sugar in diabetes it's a common problem, and it's more common when they do exercise. So some people steer away from exercise because it just makes their sugars worse. With a CGM, we've shown and others have shown that you can really alter your behavior and avoid both lows and highs, because if someone is on insulin, they're taking insulin and they see their glucose rising because they're doing very intensive exercise, they can change the insulin delivery rate to help prevent it from going too high or to bring it down if it did go high quite quickly. So they can change the insulin delivery rate on their insulin pump, or they can take a small shot of insulin with a needle if they have type 1 diabetes. And more importantly, perhaps, they can also switch what they're consuming when they see the blood sugar start to drop. Because the beauty of a sensor is it'll alert you, it'll alarm, or it'll notify you that your blood sugar is trending out of range. It's trending low. It's not low yet, so you don't have to worry. It's not dangerous yet, but it's heading in that direction. And you can see that with these little directional arrows that the CGM tells the patient. The arrow now tips down. That's when you change to consuming a sport beverage or to have a piece of fruit or something that's going to prevent that low altogether. So it's been life-changing for many individuals. I've been wearing a CGM myself now every day for probably the last 25 years and would not compete without one. There's no way.
What do you yourself do for competitions?
Well, in my mid-50s, it's more recreational, but I still do like to run and mountain bike. I do a little bit of road biking, and I love playing basketball and tennis and all the other things that everybody who's physically active loves to do.
Amazing. So now, for our listeners, I think everyone wants to know, where would you recommend someone get a CGM device or start their research on one if they're looking to incorporate this into their daily living?
One of the challenges is that CGM devices aren't easily available if you don't have diabetes, at least not in Canada and in the United States. In Europe, you are now able to get the Abbott Libre biosensor with the Supersapiens app, which is a real-time CGM that shows very high quality data and analytics on your smartphone. And if you're in Europe, you can order these through the Supersapiens website. We're still waiting for the FDA and Health Canada to approve CGM for use in people who don't have diabetes. It won't be long, though, I don't think, before we start to see CGM available as a consumer product. We'll be able to go to pharmacies or hopefully order them online and don't have to have a prescription for them, which to me, it seems silly. It's your data, it's your glucose levels, it's your ketone levels. You shouldn't have to have a prescription to have these assessed. I think eventually the FDA and Health Canada will have to realize that.
Do you know of any resources in the meantime? So for example, like I wear an Apple Watch religiously all the time. I live and breathe this thing all day.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of any equivalent data that, for example, a Fitbit or an Apple Watch can pull that can somewhat help with glucose? Like I know you're saying, it has to actually monitor the blood, but is there anything else that other wearables might pull for data?
No.
Okay.
No. But what's interesting is there is a trend where many of the manufacturers of wearables are partnering up with the CGM manufacturers. And I think that's exciting. So for example, Garmin partnered with Dexcom so that right now, if you have diabetes, you can see your glucose on your Garmin watch. You can see it on your Apple Watch. And I think it's going to be a very short period of time before you'll be able to see the CGM values if you don't have diabetes on these and other devices. Wahoo is likely to show CGM. I think CGM eventually will be on Strava. It'll be more ubiquitous than it is now. We are in early days, I think, in trying to get sensors in the hands of people who don't have diabetes, but the wave is building, and I think the consumer products are going to embrace it because basically the sensor is so small, and with Bluetooth communication, it can be read by several devices now that we have in our hands or on our wrists.
Exactly. And it just becomes all encompassing, right? I mean, at that point.
Yeah. There has been research looking at could we maybe sense the glucose through the skin in our sweat or through the teardrops, but that hasn't really materialized as being all that accurate or even cost effective to manufacture. So I think for now, we're stuck with these sensors that are going to be transdermal. They'll go through the skin, at least for the next 5 to 10 years. I don't see anything else on the horizon.
So, Dr. Riddell, as we've been talking about this, there's certain parts of this that, in a sense, kind of sound a little sci-fi-ish in, wearables under the skin and whatnot. What does the future look like for these products?
Oh gosh, I think about that a lot, Anna. I know that the watches that we have right now can do so many things for monitoring our heart health and our behaviors, but I think from an implantable sensor point of view, there are sensors in development that are actually almost like little tiny pills. They're like little tiny seeds. And in those seeds, you can use technology called fluorescence to monitor a whole bunch of different analytes in circulation. And in fact, I've been involved as a test subject for some of these that are in early development. And in fact, what they do is they make a small incision under the skin, let's say on the arm, and a tiny little seed goes in, they stitch it back up, and then you've got a monitor inside your body bathed in your interstitial fluid. And when they use fluorescence, they can measure several things on top of just glucose. Fluorescence actually can tell us things about lactate levels and ketone levels. It can tell us about alcohol levels, blood alcohol levels, for example. There may be 30 things that this one little seed could measure underneath my skin. And that sensor could be implanted for 6 months and have data streaming that could tell us all sorts of things that you may or may not want to know about yourself, that's for sure.
Fair.
So it does sound pretty sci-fi, but it's technically now possible, which I think is amazing.
That's incredible. Wow. Thank you so much for all the information you've provided our listeners with today. And this has been just an absolutely fascinating conversation with you. And thank you again for being on the show and sharing your expertise with our listeners. It was great having you.
Well, thanks, Anna. Thanks for all the great questions and enthusiasm for what's going on in the CGM space. It was a really great time.
That was Medcan fitness trainer Anna Topali in conversation with York University exercise physiology professor Mike Riddell. Riddell also serves on the scientific advisory board of Supersapiens, the maker of a blood glucose tracking app.
Which we're not endorsing. We're not saying that people should be using this stuff. We are exploring this. However, that said, if you're looking for advice managing your nutrition or your physical fitness, Medcan can help you on both fronts. Go to medcan.com to learn more or call 416-350-5900.
We'll post highlights and links at eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Say hello or send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Eat Move Think is produced by Ghost Bureau. Senior producer is Russell Gregg. I'm managing producer Jasmine Ratch.
Social media and strategy support is from Chantal Gertan and Andrea Imax. I'm executive producer Christopher Shulgin.
Remember to rate and subscribe to Eat Move Think on your favorite podcast platform. Follow our host Sean Francis on Twitter and Instagram at Sean C. Francis, that's Sean with a U, and Medcan at Medcan Live Well.
We'll be back soon with a new episode examining the latest in health and wellness.